Welcome to week 6 of our Leaving Cert History Grinds. The topic for tonight's lesson is going to be focused on the topic of Northern Ireland, and we will be looking at the welfare state under Lord Brookborough and Terence O'Neill. I will start by doing a sound and visual check. So I am talking now. If you cannot hear me or see my screen, please write in the chat and let me know. If some of you can't hear me, please restart your computer and join the class again. So here are some of our objectives for today's class. Firstly, I would like you to be able to understand what the welfare state was. Secondly, to understand the impact of gerrymandering on politics. Thirdly, to be able to describe the discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland. The fourth aim is to describe why a group called the NICRA was set up. So that's the Northern Irish Civil Rights Association. And finally, you should be able to analyse how well Brookborough and O'Neill coped with social and economic problems in Northern Ireland. Brookborough and O'Neill were both Prime Ministers of Northern Ireland. To start, we will look at some exam questions that come up on this topic. It is one of the most common topics asked in the Northern Irish section of the course. So it is definitely one that is extremely important to revise. The first question asks you, during the period 1949 to 1969, what was the significance of the developments in education, health, and housing in Northern Ireland? The next question, what were the main social and economic problems facing Northern Ireland 1949 to 69, and how effectively were they tackled? The next question asks you, during the period 1949 to 69, how successful was the government in Northern Ireland in responding to the problems posed by the economy and/or community relations? The next question asks, how was Northern Ireland affected by changes in one or more of the following: housing, education, and health? The next question asks, how successful was the government of Northern Ireland in responding to social and economic problems, 1949 to 1969? And finally, who handled social and economic problems better, Brookborough or O'Neill? Argue your case referring to both. When we look at each of these questions, the date parameter you will be looking at bases the question on the start of this topic. So 1949 to 1969 is what you were looking at. During this time period, you would have two prime ministers in charge in Northern Ireland, Brookborough and O'Neill. So you would be looking at how each of those began to tackle social and economic problems. You will see in some questions they specify education, health, and housing. Even when they don't specify that in a question and you are asked about social and economic problems, you would still be bringing in these themes into your answer. What's important to note is in some questions it asks you how effectively they were tackled or how successful was the government in responding to problems. The final question also asks you to argue a comparison. It's really important to identify what the question is asking you to achieve a good mark on your overall evaluation in these types of questions. Looking at ordinary level, For your paragraph questions, it's important to focus in on the welfare state, Sir Basil Brookborough, Terence O'Neill, and Clon and Patricia McCloskey. So they are key personalities within this section of the course. All those questions would be worth 30 marks. Looking at the longer essay style questions, the first question could ask you, how did Terence O'Neill bring about change in Northern Ireland? And you could also be asked, what did Clon and Patricia McCloskey contribute to the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland? So we will start today to look at some key personalities that are very important to address these exam questions, and to give you a background on each of the key personalities within this section of the topic. The first key personality is Lord Brookborough, or Basil Brooke. He was Prime Minister in Northern Ireland from 1943, so just before the Second World War ended. When you look at Lord Brookborough, it's important to identify who he was, and he was a unionist and member of the Orange Order, and that will be particularly important for how he tackles social and economic problems in Northern Ireland. He also believed Catholics were enemies of Northern Ireland and should not be given any power. Once again, that is going to be extremely important in looking at how he governed the state of Northern Ireland. Finally, you can see in 1933, he stated about Catholics, "I have not one about my place," and he also appealed to loyalists wherever possible to employ good Protestant lads and lassies. So he encouraged business owners, many of them who were Protestant, to employ Protestant men and women in jobs and not to employ Catholics. So when you are looking at him, you will see the background of his unionism and his membership to the Loyal Order will really influence his role in politics and his role as a Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. That is a really useful quote that you could be including in an answer as well. The next man you would be looking at is Terence O'Neill. He was the Minister for Finance under Lord Brookborough, and which later he actually became Prime Minister. He did believe that Northern Ireland could be modernised and reformed without threatening British rule. Unemployment would double than that of the rest of the UK. So there was huge levels of unemployment in the north after the Second World War, and he wanted to try and change this. He tried to attract foreign industry to Northern Ireland. So when we will be looking at him later, keep that in mind, as we saw some of the exam questions specified the economy. So that will be a key aspect you will address with Terence O'Neill. Terence O'Neill also was mainly established in Protestant areas and did not keep pace with job losses. He also introduced an official policy of Protestant and Catholic reconciliation. This is a big contrast to Lord Brookborough, but we will see that this was taken to be quite an offence to many unionists and loyalists in the north who did not believe Catholics should be given any power whatsoever. When you start the topic of Northern Ireland, it's important to gauge an understanding of the background of the foundation of Northern Ireland, even though it is before the date parameter we are talking about today. So the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 is very important to understand the state of Northern Ireland. Edward Carson was the one who negotiated with British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who actually introduced this Government of Ireland Act in 1920. The Government of Ireland Act was the official act that divided Ireland into two parts. The southern part, which had the 26 counties and was made up of 93% Catholics. In Northern Ireland, it would be left with the 6 counties, and Protestants made up 66% of the population here. The Northern Ireland was given 2 houses of Parliament, the Senate and the House of Commons, which were based in Stormont. Many nationalists rejected this act, and the War of Independence broke out. It continued until 1921, when the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. Unionists welcomed the act, however, which contained the Constitution of Northern Ireland. That stated that Northern Ireland was a self-governing region of the UK, though Article 75 said that the supreme power remained with the Westminster Parliament. The Northern Ireland government controlled internal affairs, but Westminster controlled external affairs. Northern Ireland Commons had 52 MPs to be elected by proportional representation to ensure Catholic minority got its fair share of seats. And voters in Northern Ireland elected 12 MPs to represent them in Northern Ireland. So setting the context after that. So you're looking at 1945 to 1969. So within this time period, what you are looking at is the time after the Second World War. And there was peace in Northern Ireland at this time. After the Second World War, reforms had been introduced by Westminster to show thanks to the North for its contribution to the war effort. However, it was actually the introduction of these reforms which led to discontent amongst people in Northern Ireland. With these reforms, you will see tension rising between Catholics and Protestants. In particular, you will see Catholic discrimination in things like housing, voting, employment, education, healthcare. And because of the discrimination, frustration and tension began to rise over time. And this rising of tension culminated in violence in the 1960s. And that signified the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the late 60s. With this topic and with this exam question, you look at the time before the Troubles and identify how Northern Ireland was affected by the introduction of these reforms. Okay, so we've just looked at how there was a unionist government set up in Stormont. The unionists believed that Northern Ireland could only survive if all of the power in the north was in safe Protestant hands. As we saw there, Catholics only made up a third of the population. However, they did have majorities in certain regions within the north. Examples in some counties like Tyrone, Fermanagh, Derry City, South Armagh and South Down. Catholics were nationalists who resented the partition from the rest of Ireland, and unionists believed they could not be trusted with any power. So there were still nationalists who were Catholics living in the north, and they did not want the partition in the north. And they were extremely frustrated with expressing their identity within the region of Ireland. So because of the Unionist fear and the threat they felt from Catholics, they ensured Catholics would not get any power in society. And they did this through a couple of things. Firstly, we are going to look at how they impact law and order. Secondly, we will look at something called gerrymandering. The third thing we will look at is discrimination in housing in particular. And finally, something called a west of the river ban policy. Law and order is an important place to start, particularly when you're looking at who has power in Northern Ireland. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, or the RUC, was set up by the new state in 1920. But 90% of the men who worked for the RUC were Protestant. The RUC also had other divisions. One division in particular was known as the B Specials. They were all Protestants. And what's important about the B Specials is they are known for their terror and violence. And you will particularly see this at times during the Troubles and how they treat Catholics. As well as this, the police force was able to use something called the Special Powers Act. This was introduced to kind of restore law and order when the state of Northern Ireland was set up. So you're looking there at the date of 1922. So with the Special Powers Act, it allowed the RUC to arrest without a warrant, to intern without trial, and it had unlimited powers of search, the authority to ban meetings and publications. This was a huge power of the police force. In particular, because the police force were Protestant, it was a really effective way for them to ensure they had control over Catholics. As well, it is also important to note from a law perspective, almost all judges and magistrates were Protestant, and they were closely associated with the Unionist Party. So any decisions that were made in a courtroom, you can see they were backed by the Protestant outlook and the unionism to ensure Catholics did not have power in Northern Ireland. So what's also important to note is this Special Powers Act to identify how significant this powers was for police is it gave the police force more power than any other police force in any other democracy in the Western world. So that is just putting it into context what this law meant and the control that this law allowed the police force to have. Many accusations of police brutality were made by nationalists and human rights campaigners. In the 1980s, you would have seen later on in this topic, the Stalker Inquiry was set up to investigate an alleged shoot to kill policy. And this would have been at a time during the Troubles. Allegations and evidence of collusion between the RUC and loyalist paramilitary organisations also emerged in the 80s and 90s, and the RUC targeted by the IRA and other nationalist paramilitary groups, which may have added to their distrust and negative attitudes towards the nationalist community. So there you're seeing a bit of a background about how over time, because of the police force, divisions between the communities became more and more divided. And here you were looking at time periods of the 80s and 90s during the Troubles when tension was still continuing. The second thing that was done to ensure Catholics would not have power in society was something called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering was basically the unionist way to rig voting systems. How they did this was through redrawing electoral constituencies, and by doing that, they would ensure unionists would always win the elections. So areas that would have a Catholic majority in their population still would be elected a unionist to local government because of this redrawing of boundaries. The most extreme example of this is in Derry City. Within Derry, there was a 70% Catholic population. The arrangement of wards in the city ensured that some 7,500 unionist voters could elect 12 members to the Derry Corporation, while 10,000 nationalists could only elect 8 members. In this manner, unionists control the city corporation while the nationalist majority was left without power or influence. What's important about being part of local corporations and city corporations is that you will be making decisions on perhaps things like housing and social housing, which we will see will be extremely important. As well as this, with the ability to vote, owners of property and businesses received additional votes in local elections. So at this time, most property and businesses were actually owned by Protestants. So it gave them a further advantage in elections as well. So they had more votes than Catholics. There was also voting inequality in Parliament. So in the 1920s, a proportional representation system of voting was in place. So this basically means the party that gets a number of seats roughly equivalent to their percentage of support, and a party with the support of 20% of the voters gets 20% of seats. This was replaced by the first to the post system, which was the first person with the biggest number of votes gets elected in the area. And this first to the post type of voting system usually favors the largest party in a society. And in this case, in most parts of Northern Ireland, this would be the UUP, or the Ulster Unionist Party. A third way to keep Catholics out of power was discrimination in employment. In civil service jobs, 90% of the people working in those jobs were Protestant. The 10% of Catholics that were actually employed in the civil service were in kind of low-ranking jobs with low pay. Catholics were excluded from senior posts in civil service, so there would be no job progressions for them. And many private companies discriminated against Catholics. The majority of people who were unemployed were Catholics, and this was almost 200% higher than the amount of Protestants who were unemployed. As we saw with the Prime Minister, Lord Brookborough, this was also promoted amongst many people in society, including the Prime Minister. We also could see discrimination in housing. So the most serious charges of discrimination was in public housing, in the hands of local councils. And as we saw earlier, those local councils were controlled by majority unionists. One example of a protest against this was by a man called Austin Curry, and he organised a sit-in in Armagh because in 1968, there was a protest because a 19-year-old Protestant woman who was single was offered a social house or social housing from the government over a Catholic family. So here you are seeing that discrimination being highlighted through an example. Using examples in your paragraphs is really important to bring up your marks further. The fourth thing is the west of the ban policy. The river ban roughly divides Northern Ireland into east and west. Generally speaking, Protestants would be to the east of the ban, and the Catholic majority would be in the rural west of the ban. Fermanagh, Tyrone and Derry City all have Catholic majorities. Stormont decided to create employment opportunities in areas east of the ban to benefit Protestants. Area to the west of the ban was always neglected, and there was not those job opportunities developing. Unemployment and immigration amongst Catholics were also higher in these areas, and many had decided that they would not develop these areas. You would also see in the case study with this topic, it was decided not to put a new university in Derry City, which would be a city associated with a Catholic majority. Instead, it was put 60 kilometres away in a Protestant town of Coleraine. And this would prove very controversial. So next, you need to look at what was Northern Ireland like under Lord Brookborough. So Basil Brooke became Prime Minister of Northern Ireland during the Second World War. And throughout his time in office, he maintained unionist control of Northern Ireland. The coming to power of a Labour government in Britain in 1945 posed difficulties for the Unionist Party, which did not traditionally support the policies of that left-wing politics. However, it was reassured by the strengthening connection between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom when that Labour government passed something called the Northern Ireland Act. And this stated Northern Ireland could not leave the United Kingdom without the consent of the Northern Ireland Parliament. So that was really important for the Unionists at the time. What was introduced was something called the welfare state. So like the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland benefited from these social reforms in areas of welfare, healthcare, and education. And in the aftermath of the Second World War, what this welfare state did was introduce benefits such as free healthcare, free second level education. And this was extremely important for the people of Great Britain, but now also for the people of Northern Ireland as well. Also, one thing that was of particular significance was the introduction of the Education Act in 1947, which made secondary school education available to all children over the age of 11. Grants were also given out to people who wanted to go to third level colleges. However, many unionists initially actually resisted this welfare state, and because it benefited everyone in the North, Catholics and Protestants alike, they believed that this may give Catholics some power in the North if they began to benefit. Eventually, it was implemented and it became more prosperous and left the Republic far behind in social and economic terms. So next we will look at housing, education and healthcare. We will look at what reforms were introduced, and in particular, we will look at how they created divisions in society. With housing before World War II, poor housing in Catholic and Protestant working areas. In Derry in particular, you would have seen Catholics living in overcrowded houses and in flats. Many of the houses had no running water or toilet facilities. In 1945, there was a Northern Ireland Housing Trust that was set up, and it gave people the power to borrow money to build houses. And 113,000 houses were built. Now, the issue with this is the allocation of these houses. The trust, the housing trust that was set up, didn't discriminate. However, it was the local authority were given control of who would get the houses. And as we know, due to things like gerrymandering, the local authorities were dominated by unionists. And this led to discrimination in housing. People had been living in dark, cramped cottages. You could have had families of 8 living in 2 rooms. Also, as well, the bombing of Belfast during the Belfast Blitz destroyed many homes. So people actually refer to these areas as slums. Due to the Housing Trust, this all did change, but it is still important to note that most of these houses were given to Protestants. So this caused problems. There was discrimination against Catholics when it came to selecting new tenants of these houses. 12 local councils were all west of the Bann. Most notably was Dungannon, Derry and Omagh, which particularly discriminated against Catholics. As mentioned earlier, here you could bring in the case of Austin Curry. And as mentioned, he was the person who protested by squatting in a new house that was given to a 19-year-old single Protestant woman. One reason why Catholics were discriminated against here was because Brookborough had refused to get rid of the property qualification to vote. So, as I mentioned earlier, the extra votes that were given to Protestants. So when you're looking here at how Brookborough effectively or successfully tackled the problems, here you are seeing he did not do anything for Catholics. So an owner of property had the right to vote. As the area of the Derry voting system was rigged, 60% of the local council was controlled by unionists. So with these social reforms, it led to tensions between both sides. And despite the fact that it was an excellent idea, it never intended to benefit Protestants more than Catholics. However, it led to further discrimination. So the intentions of the ideas of the reforms were good. However, it led to more and more tensions between the two sides. Reforms were also brought in education. As mentioned, the Education Act of 1947 is an act that was particularly important. Protestants were concerned it reduced the role of religious instruction in schools. It also implemented something called the 11+ exam, which allowed the top 20% to attend a grammar school. Local authorities had to provide free medical inspection and treatment. They would get free transport, they'd get milk and meals and books all given to them in school. Large school grants also meant the majority of students did not pay fees. So this had a really positive impact as the numbers intending second level increased by 100%. Catholic bishops, though, did complain that state grants were lower for voluntary Catholic schools. Negotiations saw grants increase to 65% and to 100% when schools allowed council representation on the school committee. Catholics did benefit from the increased spending at third level. The problems and discrimination were definitely seen here. Both groups, there was contention over the curriculum. Catholics wanted Irish history and Catholicism to be taught to religious education, as well as Irish, whereas Protestants wanted British history and Protestantism to be taught. Catholics eventually decided to withdraw from these state schools and set up their own Catholic schools. These were still state subsidied, but they only received 65% of the grants, so they did not receive all of the benefits. However, 90% of Catholic students received scholarships, but this still led to tensions because of the discrimination. But the new education had an enormous effect on Catholics who previously would not have continued their education. Now you were seeing the opportunity to attend school for free. And this led to the emergence of a new group of young, educated Catholics in the 1960s. And similarly to all over the world, you would see that this decade would be quite well known for an era of people for standing up for their rights against the abuses. You would see here, John Hume and Bernadette Devlin were two people who benefited from this education programme. Healthcare also received changes in the scheme. The health service in the north had been underfunded and poorly serviced. So the welfare state brought in major changes and introduced free healthcare to all. It also increased spending in hospitals and a new screening programme for TB. Once again, you will see discrimination against the Catholics. We know Mater hospitals would have been run by Catholic nuns, and they rejected placing the hospital under the control of hospital authorities, as they feared they would be compelled to provide abortions and contraception, which was against the Catholic beliefs. So they opted out of the scheme and did not receive grants. This meant Catholics had to support the Catholic nuns in their hospitals. So you have Catholics here who would be paying the higher rate of taxes for the welfare state, but from a medical perspective, did not receive the benefits. And this led to resentment among Catholics. Another thing that Lord Brookborough did successfully was he launched something called Operation Harvest, which was the IRA launched the operation, and this would be seen as a success by Brookborough, where Operation Harvest was launched by the IRA to try and bring down the Northern Irish government. And here, Brookborough introduced internment, which was very effective on the tensions beginning to rise in the north. The economy was not that effective. The economy of Northern Ireland had reduced significantly after the Second World War. You had high levels of unemployment continuing during Brookborough, and he was forced to resign. To replace Lord Brookborough was Terence O'Neill. Here you will see how he brings in a policy of Catholic and Protestant reconciliation. One thing he does is he organises a meeting with Sean Lemass. And with the meeting, he wanted to introduce forms of cooperation between North and South. And the visit was seen as a huge success, but it also provoked protests from extreme Protestants like Ian Paisley. Many Protestants viewed these visits with their dismay as they believed Catholics were their enemies. At this point, you would also see during Terence O'Neill's reign that problems still continue with discrimination that had been seen under the Brookborough reign. So although he wanted to introduce reconciliation, changes and reforms and discrimination in other areas of society continued. Dr. Clun and Patricia McCloskey are two very important key people to signify the origins of protests against the civil rights movement. At this point in Northern Ireland, there was a housing shortage and it had reached crisis point, in particular in areas like Dungannon. In 1963, no Catholic family had been given a permanent house by local council. So they set up the Homeless Citizens League and they started protests. They also extended their campaign afterwards to all of Northern Ireland, and they wrote a pamphlet, The Plain Truth, which was actually published. Many pleas were ignored, but it became clear that change would not come from books and speeches like they had envisaged, but action they needed to now do on the streets. So this led to the beginning of the civil rights. As a result of the welfare state and investment, Catholics now became better educated. They started to demand equal rights. In 1966, Gerry Fitt becomes MP for West Belfast and gets support from British MPs for equal rights. The Civil Rights Association had been inspired by the civil rights movement in America. And with this group, the NICRA, they didn't want to end partition. They just wanted equality. They believed that if they were going to be part of the UK, that they deserved to be treated equally. And they had 5 demands. They believed in one person, one vote, redrawing of electoral boundaries to end gerrymandering, laws against all forms of discrimination, to repeal the Special Powers Act, and finally, the disbandment of the B specials. So with these Civil Rights Association of Northern Ireland, with their demands, they started to become more organised. And with their aims, they started to develop protests. Unlike Sinn Féin and the IRA, as mentioned, they did not want to end the partition. They wanted to be treated like citizens of the UK, and members of this association included people like Gerry Fitt, John Hume, Austin Currie, and Bernadette Devlin. Many of these men will be key personalities you will see throughout this topic. While their intention was to start peaceful protests throughout Northern Ireland, you will see between 1968 and 1969, tensions began to rise further. Some events to take note of was a Derry City March in October 1968. Within this peaceful protest, the protesters were told that they could not enter some areas of Derry, and they continued to march into those areas. Tensions began to break out between the protesters and the RUC. Many images and footage of police brutality and violence against the protesters was caught on media reports. Another protest was carried out in January 1969 in Burntalla Bridge. Now, the difference for this protest was the protest was interrupted by many paramilitaries and extremists who were waiting at Burntalla Bridge to attack the protesters. So unionists and loyalists waiting at this bridge. And there was members of the RUC there who were supposed to be stopping any violence from breaking out, but they simply just watched the violence. So here, tensions rising again. The RUC raid on the Bogside after that day led to clashes between the rioters and the RUC. In particular, a man called Samuel Devenny was very badly beaten by the RUC, and he actually died 3 months later. So media coverage was turning international public opinion against unionists and putting pressure on the British government to act and make changes. So O'Neill does introduce some reforms as he is pressured by Harold Wilson, who is the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, to introduce the reforms. Reforms introduced related to local councils, local elections, and parts of the special powers were removed. So here you are seeing some progressions, but these were not all of the demands that should have been met by the NICRA. And it also began to anger some unionists as well. So you have O'Neill now, neither side is happy with him. And he made a speech called the Crossroads speech on TV, looking for public support. O'Neill's fall from power then, he resigned due to the pressure and rising tensions of everything going on in Northern Ireland, and was replaced by a man called James Chichester Clark. When you're looking at the exam question here, you would be able to see with this example, you're looking at social and economic problems. You're seeing your date parameter, including both prime ministers, and you must reflect on how effectively they were tackled. You are constantly recycling the word effectively. Here you can see some sample themes you could include for the breakdown of an essay on this question. And with those themes, you could extend by putting key statistics into the paragraphs. Once again, you have 41 minutes to write this essay question. As mentioned, you need to be referring to whether Brookborough or O'Neill handled these social and economic problems effectively. In every paragraph, please use that word and keep referring to the question. Do not summarize what happened. You would be looking at an introduction, a minimum of 7 paragraphs, and a conclusion here. Next week's topic is going to be continuing with the topic of Northern Ireland, and it will be looking at 2 case studies on this topic: the Apprentice Boys of Derry and the Coleraine controversy. Thank you.